Welcome and thanks to all of you for joining the Office of Diversity of the Unified Court System, the Franklin Williams Commission, and the Historical Society of the Courts, who all came together to make this program possible. I want to take a few minutes to tell you how I conceived of this program before I introduce the Chief Judge, and also to let you know who I am. I'm Eileen Millett. I'm counsel in the Office of Court Administration. Having been here for just a little under a year. And I have to tell all of you that I credit Judge Elizabeth Gary, the presiding justice of the Appellate Division for the Third Department, with being the catalyst for bringing this program together. Judge Gary called me the day before Juneteenth and asked if I had received the governor's executive order, and also asked if I had seen the Tulsa documentary. I answered yes to the first question and no to the second. But I did tell Judge Gary that I was generally aware that communities throughout this country, Black communities, were burned out of their residences and businesses during Jim Crow out of jealousy, racism, whatever term you like to ascribe to it. I told her that that gave me a thought because she asked what she could read and how she could be better educated. And I said to her, it brings to mind a book written by Professor Stephen Carter about his grandmother, the first Black female assistant district attorney in Manhattan. And I said the catalyst for their leaving their home in Atlanta and coming to New York was businesses and homes in Atlanta being burned out. And that was the impetus for this program. So you ask, what's the relevance of someone who was born in 1899 and was doing the work that she did in the 1930s? And I would like to share with you something that Faulkner wrote. Writing in 1951, William Faulkner said, "The past is never dead. It is not even past. All of us labor in webs spun long before we were born, webs of heredity and environment, of desire and consequence, of history and eternity." I hoped that the book Invisible would be a piece of how we might think about advancing people on the basis of talent, and at the same time, creating a stronger and more successful, inclusive society. And I want to pick up on that theme by telling you that I think we have a Chief Justice in Janet DiFiore who has had a long commitment to inclusiveness. And that brings me to a conversation I had with her at a Black partner lunch. We're seated between Alfonso David, the counsel to the governor, and Judge DiFiore. After she was introduced by Peter Sherwood, she encouraged Black partners who wish to have public service as a capstone to their careers to consider applying for judgeship, and specifically Court of Claims judgeships, which are gubernatorial appointments. And during that lunch, she sat and told me about why she decided to become not a lawyer, but a prosecutor. She told me all about her family and her background, being the only child of Italian immigrants and having a lifelong residence in Westchester County. She was born in Mount. She graduated from C.W. Post High School on Long Island. She started in the DA's office, left the DA's office to go to private practice, was appointed to the Court of Appeals as Chief Judge in 2016 by Governor Mario Cuomo. I give you Chief Judge Janet DiFiore.
Good afternoon, and welcome to this live webinar showcasing the life and career of Eunice Carter. Allow me to begin by thanking everyone who made today's program possible. My predecessor, my dear friend and mentor, Jonathan Lippman, president of the Historical Society of the New York Courts, and the Society's executive director, Marilyn Marcus. Appellate Division Justices Troy Weber and Shirley Troutman, the co-chairs of our Franklin H. Williams Judicial Commission. Tony Walters, director of our Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Cyrus R. Vance, Jr., the distinguished district attorney of New York County, who will be dedicating a historic plaque honoring Miss Carter at the district attorney's office in Manhattan. And of course, Eileen Millett, counsel at the Office of Court Administration, whose idea it was to invite Miss Carter's biographers, her grandson, Professor Stephen L. Carter of Yale Law School, and great-granddaughter, Leah Carter, Esquire, to share their stories about this extraordinary woman and the moving book they have written about her. So thank you to all of you. Today's program comes at a unique moment in our history. We are at once in the midst of a serious public health crisis that has had a disproportionate impact on people and communities of color. And we are at a time of reckoning on race and racial injustices in America. And we know and understand that the public rightly looks to our courts above all institutions for fairness and equal treatment. And we also know and understand that we cannot function or carry out our mission without the public's faith, trust, and confidence in our work. That is why, as judges, lawyers, and court professionals, we have a solemn, ongoing, and continuing obligation as leaders to promote diversity, meaningful inclusiveness, and equal justice in our courts. And that is why, over the summer, we engaged Jay Johnson, highly regarded lawyer and public servant, to conduct an independent review of our court system's response to issues of racial bias and to identify our shortcomings and make recommendations for change. And Secretary Johnson has called upon us to make a commitment from the top in order to achieve a policy of zero tolerance for racial bias in the New York State courts. And not only do I make that commitment on behalf of all of us and along with our entire court leadership team across the state, but we fully embrace and will honor that commitment in every way that we can and should, because there can be no higher priority for us as an institution. And with that commitment, of course, comes the hard work of transformation, of promoting inclusiveness, achieving true diversity, and engaging in honest, sometimes difficult conversations and dialogue within our own court family. And what a perfect way to begin the dialogue, sharing and learning about the life story of Eunice Carter, a story that illuminates a unique chapter in the history of racial discrimination in our society and in our legal profession. Eunice Carter was a brilliant lawyer who more than held her own among the best and brightest legal minds of her generation. She was the mastermind behind the legal strategy that convicted Lucky Luciano and enhanced the national reputation and profile of Thomas Dewey, who went on to serve as governor of our state and run for president of the United States. And yet, for all of her undeniable merit and extraordinary achievements, Miss Carter was paid far less than her white male peers, and she was never able to achieve her dream of securing a judicial appointment. That Eunice Carter didn't receive the recognition that she so rightly deserved during her lifetime underscores the painful legacy of racial discrimination in America, a legacy that continues to haunt our nation and undermine our values and our unity as a people. It is my sincere hope that this program, showcasing the amazing life of Eunice Carter, is one piece of our work together, moving us forward toward a deeper understanding of how our society has so often failed to value the contributions of people of color, and why it is so very, very important that we come together not only to celebrate our diversity, but to rededicate ourselves to inclusiveness, to fair and even treatment of everyone among us, and to equal justice for all. So thank you all for participating today, and my very best wishes for a meaningful program.
Next up is the former Chief Justice of our Court of Appeals, Jonathan Lippman. Native, he attended Stuyvesant High School. And I'm not going to read you most of his bio, but I'd like to tell you how I encountered Judge Lippman. And that was at yearly meetings that were convened by the chief judge and the president of the New York State Bar Association to meet with the deans of the 15 law schools in New York. At the time, I was co-chair of the Committee on Legal Education and Admission to the Bar. And in that capacity, I came to know Judge Lippman's energy and his dogged devotion and passion for our court system. He was appointed to the Court of Appeals in 1995, to the Court of Claims in 1995 by then Governor George Pataki. And he served as the Chief Administrative Judge for 11 years, the longest of anybody in that position. He is a proud member and trustee of the Historical Society. I give you Judge Lippman.
As president of the Historical Society of the Courts of the State of New York, I am so pleased to welcome you to our Eunice Carter webinar, focusing on the life of a brilliant lawyer and her role in history. Although regrettably, Eunice Carter did not receive the recognition that she deserved in a lifetime, this kind of program demonstrates how the mission of the Historical Society remains entirely relevant to what is happening in our country and in our justice system today. The story of Eunice Carter has an important and valuable role to play in imparting the lessons of history as we go about confronting today's challenges and realities. Just as we did with the Society's excellent program on the 1918 Spanish flu, where we revisited how our country dealt with an earlier pandemic and with the many difficult public health related legal issues that continue to persist and resonate today. And that, of course, is what the Society is doing with today's program on Eunice Carter, which comes, in the words of Chief Judge DiFiore, at a time of reckoning for racial injustice in America. And it serves to illuminate the damaging legacy of racism in our justice system and in our society, and demonstrating why we have so much more work to do to heal our divisions and to promote diversity, inclusiveness, and justice for all, regardless of the color of someone's skin or the amount of money in their pocket. The Historical Society of the Courts of the State of New York, now as in the past, will continue to present programs that lets our storied history light the path for the future and well-being of our justice system and our society. Please enjoy the program. It's great to have you with us today.
I would now like to introduce you to Judge Troy Weber, an Associate Justice of the Appellate Division, First Department. Judge Weber joined with us and the Franklin Williams Commission to make this program possible today, and was really the person who brought us the idea of using the motif that we've used throughout our program of Eunice Carter, because there is a plaque that hangs in the Manhattan DA's office where Judge Weber started her career. She also was a deputy bureau chief at the New York City Corporation Council, and 23 years after being elected to the civil court, was appointed to the appellate division of the First Department. Judge Weber shares something in common with the Carters, in that she has a daughter who was recently admitted to the bar. And you will all hear that the Carters are now 4 generations strong. We don't know about the latest edition and whether he'll follow, and there'll be a 5th generation of lawyers in the Carter family. But I give you Judge Weber.
Thank you, Ms. Millett. It is my honor and pleasure to be part of this very important and exciting program and to represent the Williams Commission, which, as stated, is a co-sponsor of the program. The Williams Commission was established in 1991, and it is dedicated not only to ensuring racial and ethnic equality in the court system, but also to educate and advise on issues affecting both employees and litigants of color within the system. The commission serves as a conduit to persons of color in the court system with court administration to address issues pertaining to racial and ethnic fairness in the courts. It also acts as a liaison to community groups and fraternal organizations within the court, bar associations, and judicial appointing authorities. We also sponsor and co-sponsor programs such as this to improve the perception of fairness within the court system, to ensure equality, and to highlight the achievements of individuals of color within the court system. Now, while I'm here representing the Williams Commission, I hope that I'm not being presumptuous in stating that I am also unofficially representing the past, present, and dare I say, future Black female ADAs in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. I was appointed as an Assistant District Attorney in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office in 1981 upon my graduation from law school. At the time I joined the office, there were 2 Black ADAs in the trial division. Now I believe there are about 22. So when I joined the office, I became the 3rd Black female ADA in that office. At the time, I had no idea who Eunice Carter was or that she was the first Black female ADA in the office. Indeed, I did not learn of her until I read Professor Carter's book. ADA Eunice Carter is yet another example of a hidden figure, an individual long overlooked for her brilliance, achievements, and sacrifice. We as Black ADAs, in fact, Black female attorneys, we all stand on her shoulders as she led the way for myself and for others to achieve the positions we have attained. So, on behalf of all the Black female ADAs, I say to you, ADA Eunice Carter, thank you, and I thank you, Professor Carter, for making her invisible no more. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Weber. Now it is my distinct pleasure to bring you Professor Stephen Carter and his daughter Leah Carter to talk about his grandmother and her great-grandmother. And I'm not going to bore you with some of the mundane details of Professor Carter's bio, but I will tell you the things that intrigued me about the professor. He was raised in a family that was committed to public service, and it struck me that his mother worked as an executive director for Julian Bond, someone I believe to be one of the greatest orators of our time. His father was an attorney who became an administrator and later a president of Cornell University. Professor Carter, in addition to teaching, finds time to do an awful lot of writing and has done it since high school, when he was the editor-in-chief in his high school in Ithaca of The Tatler. But since that time, he's published 15 books, 6 novels, and it goes on. When I approached Professor Carter and his daughter about doing this program, which, as I said, was on Juneteenth, they immediately agreed. And that's a testament to their commitment to the importance of civic education and civics in itself, which Judge Carter deals with in his book, Civility. I actually met the Carters in November of 2018 when I attended a program where they spoke at the New York Public Library. And I was struck by some of the parallels with the Carter's family and my own, even though my parents were immigrants. But I spoke to them, I stayed after the program, and there was so much of the book that intrigued me and came to life for me that I decided it was not something that I could let go of. And as I said, after Judge Gary asked me the questions that she did and I thought about it, it seemed to me that it would be a perfect book to bring to my attorneys and counsel's office. And then as I thought more of it, I said that the book was too important and Professor Carter was too important and Leah was too important to only have 23 people hear him speak. And I thought, how could we really get this program out to a larger audience? And so I'm really thrilled today that with the help of the Historical Society and the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, that we were really able to bring this program together. And I give you now Professor Well, let me give you Leah first, because Leah and I had a very interesting conversation a week or so ago. And as I said, there are so many things about the book that intrigued me, one of which is that Eunice Carter lived on Decatur Street, and so did my parents, and so did my grandmother. And oddly enough, when Addie and William, Eunice's parents, were traveling, Eunice and her brother Adolphus were left in the care of the Hastroms. So were we. And so I think there's a connection to the Hastrom family that lived on Decatur Street. Leah's and that's how actually I came to know Leah better, because I went up to her and I said, I really want you to drill down and figure out how we have this connection to the Hastroms. And Leah said to me, well, here's my email. We can be in touch. And so we did stay in touch. Leah is a Yale grad. She has an undergraduate degree from Dartmouth, where my ex-husband taught. She told me that she wanted to get her PhD in philosophy. That was her undergraduate major. And that her thought was that she'd become a professor after she got her JD. She'd get a PhD in philosophy. She's since come away from that, but did what most people do after law school. She joined Paul Weiss. And I think knew from the beginning that that was not going to be her career path. And so after 4 years of practice and casting about for something to do, she said she was visiting with her parents, and her father said he was learning so much about his grandmother and his grandparents that he didn't know about, his great-grandparents. And she said, well, why not help? Why shouldn't I help with the research? And so she did. And she related a very poignant story to me of sitting in the Howard University library and reading a letter written by her great-great-grandfather, William Carter, where he's writing to a friend of his and looking over his life. And she said that the letter was written so beautifully that she really started to cry, and she realized that she was really coming to know her great-great-grandparents through archival work, and she talked about how much she loved it. And so I think there's another career path for you there, Leah. And with that, I give you Professor Stephen Carter and Leah Carter.
Well, first of all, let me thank Eileen Millett for the idea, and Judge Weber and the others who've also spoken. Thank you all for this invitation. And thank you all also for being here and wanting to hear about Eunice's remarkable story.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the Inclusion, the Franklin Williams Commission, the Historical Society of the Court, and especially to Eileen. Thank you for, having this idea, for putting this all together and reaching out to me about it. And yeah, thanks to everyone who's agreed to participate today. I think Eunice would always be, she would be proud to know that she's getting this attention and that people are talking about her accomplishments.
I should explain two things. One is that Leah and I settled on a tag team format, so you're going to see us going back and forth a little bit as we try to at least hit some of the highlights of Eunice's quite remarkable story. But I also want to say at the beginning, I want to make clear that although my name is on the front of the book, it's a book that would not have been anything like what it is without not only Leah's fantastic research. She went to archives all over the place, but also without her ideas, her commitment to the story, and her own interest in it as well. And so I'm grateful for that. And we're going to start really with the part of the story that, for lack of a better term, makes it most newsworthy, and that's the Luciano trial. That is to say, how did a Black woman in 1936 in New York come to be one of the team of prosecutors involved in bringing to justice the most powerful mafia leader in the country? And I'm going to hit only a few highlights of the story, since we don't have time, of course, to tell it all, and then we'll talk more about who Eunice was, where she came from, And it will also end up by drawing some lessons, perhaps, at least lessons that we draw. Others may draw other lessons as well from her work. You have to go back to the 1930s in New York. At this time, New York was basically seen as a fixed city, which is to say that the mob had its tentacles everywhere, took tribute from pretty much everywhere, and operated with impunity because there were so many corrupt officials, so many corrupt cops. Everyone was either on the take or paying tribute, at least so it seemed. There were a lot of civic reformers in the newspapers and elsewhere constantly calling for an investigation of the mob. That didn't happen for a long time, in part because the New York District Attorney at the time was a man named William Copeland Dodge, who was himself, we now know, on the take. And therefore, although he occasionally would prosecute a small mob figure, he never was interested in taking on anyone larger than that. The other thing you have to know about New York at the time is that for all of the money that the mob made, and the mob, when we say the mob, we tend to think of the mafia, but actually there were a number of different ethnic gangs which worked together to think of as the mob. They were not by any means all Italian-American gangs. There were a number of different groups working together, including black gangs as well. And that's significant because by far the most lucrative mob territory in the country at the time was Harlem. The mob, by most accounts, made more money in Harlem than in the rest of New York, all the boroughs combined. And most of that money in New York, in Harlem, some was protection money, some was loan sharking, but the bulk of it was from the numbers game, also known back then as policy banking and a variety of other things as well, the illegal gambling on the numbers. That was run for the rest of the mobsters largely by a man named Dutch Schultz, although the newspapers at the time mistakenly thought that Dutch Schultz was actually running the mob. He was actually running Harlem for the mob. So anyway, reformers were clamoring for an investigation of the mob. The mob was too powerful and so on. So under pressure, William Copeland, the corrupt DA, impaneled a grand jury and said, we're going to investigate the mob. The trouble was that all he ever brought to the grand jury were very, very low-level mobsters, no one with any authority or power. So finally, literally, the grand jurors kicked the DA's office out of the room, refused to hear any more cases brought by the DA, and complained to the judge that the DA was not taking this seriously. Now, you might think that at that moment, a prosecutor would simply impanel a new grand jury, but there wasn't time for that because by the time Dodge might have gotten around to that, the governor, Governor Lippman, had gotten interested, and the head of the grand jury met with the governor, told him what was going on, violated grand jury secrecy to tell the governor what was happening, and the governor said to Dodge, the DA, that you have to appoint a special prosecutor. It has to be one of the people from my list. It's not someone you're going to pick. There were some shenanigans around that, but in the end, the special prosecutor who was appointed, of course, was Thomas Dewey. And Thomas Dewey, as part of his appointment, was promised, among other things, his own staff, his own budget, even his own offices, so that he took offices in the Woolworth building and spent money completely redoing them to cover the windows and put in all these interior barriers and so on, so one person wouldn't know what was going on in the next office. And he proceeded to hire a group of 20 lawyers to go after organized crime in New York, who the press quickly dubbed 20 against the underworld. He hired 19 white men and 1 black woman. That black woman was Eunice Carter. And what's interesting is the newspapers at the time gave much bigger play to Negro woman, as they said, being hired than to anyone else. In fact, she was the only one of the assistants who got her photograph in the New York Times and the Herald Tribune, which at the time was the second biggest newspaper in New York. They both put a photograph on page 3. It was a big deal that she was hired, but then it came time for Dewey to divide up the responsibilities. And he had these various assistants. This one was going to look at loan sharking. This one was going to look at crimes involving organized labor. This one was going to look at drug dealing. This one was going to look at murder. This one was going to look at the numbers game, and so on and so on and so on. Eunice was assigned to look into prostitution. And I mention that because prostitution was one of the things that Dewey made absolutely clear from the beginning. He had no interest in prosecuting. He said, I'm not here to prosecute people for vice. I'm here to prosecute, he said, real crimes. Not only did Eunice get assigned to prosecution, which was the traditional work of women prosecutors at the time, she also got assigned the smallest office at the end of a long hallway furthest from Dewey himself. It was plain that not much was expected of her. But over time, she was the sort, this is the way that she was, if they give you lemons, make lemonade. If prosecution was what she was going to handle, then she was going to handle it right. And over time, through carefully and with discipline and perseverance, gathering evidence, interviewing, I won't go into all the details, they're in the book, she put together a case that prostitution in New York was not, as everyone thought, a group of independent contractors, but instead was run by something called the Combination, which paid tribute to Luciano. The reason that mattered was that if you could show that in court, then Luciano would be guilty of conspiracy, even if he never touched the prostitution business himself. Dewey was skeptical, not only because he didn't believe that prostitution had any kind of central apparatus, but also because, again, he didn't want to be a vice prosecutor. He wanted to get Luciano on something bigger than that. And by the way, as a footnote, why is he going after Luciano instead of going after Dutch Schultz, who had been running the mob in Harlem? The answer was because by then Luciano had killed Dutch Schultz, as he tended to kill people who were in his way in his climb to the top. But in the end, unable to make a case on anything else, somewhat reluctantly, based on the evidence gathered by Eunice, Dewey agreed to indict Luciano on prostitution charges, and did so. And Luciano fled to New York, he fled to Arkansas, he hid out in Hot Springs, eventually was arrested and brought back. Then it came time to try the case. So here you have Eunice, who's been working on nothing else, who has done all the interviews, all the interviews with members of the public who have seen prostitution, all the interviews of the women who are prepared to accuse Luciano himself in order to create that link necessary for the conspiracy statute. She's outlined all this. She's written it up in enormous detail. Naturally, she'll be one of the prosecutors who tries the case, except that she isn't. The prosecutor is Dewey, and he chooses 3 or 4, depending on the day, white males to work with him on the case, none of which had originally been involved in the investigation of prostitution, but all of whom were involved in the other crimes. Well, all right. Again, Eunice's view, lemons, lemonade. She works hard on the trial behind the scenes. She works hard preparing the witnesses, particularly the women, because the women are the only link between Luciano and prostitution. So their testimony has to be persuasive. Moreover, this is at a time, remember, when it was quite likely that members of the jury would be skeptical of them because of how they earned their living. So she's in charge of preparing them. She's in charge of creating the trial memos for the rest of the staff. She's also in charge of housing them, which is to say, arranging housing that will be places where they can stay and then be guarded by the police to avoid intimidation. There are 68 prosecution witnesses in the trial. Only 4 implicate Luciano. One we need to deal with was not, I think, believable. The other 3 are all among these women, and Luciano's lawyer goes after them very, very hard. One of them, in fact, a woman who amused the newspapers, a woman named Coke Flo Brown, showed up for court apparently in withdrawal. She was a heroin addict, and several times during her testimony, this is a true story, the trial judge, Judge McCook, allowed her to take a shot of brandy on the witness stand in order to calm her nerves. Eventually, the defense objected that she was currently, in her testimony in the courtroom, under the influence of heroin. And so a doctor was summoned, and Cokie Flo was taken to another room where the only lawyer in the room, there's no defense lawyer, the only lawyer in there was Eunice, because she was the only female lawyer in the courtroom that day. So she observed the doctor's examination, and the doctor concluded that, in fact, Cokie Flo was not under the influence. There were some other issues that arose at the trial that could have implicated Eunice in certain ways, particularly some allegations that one of the witnesses had been allowed to go out and drink in the evening during the time she was supposed to be sequestered. Eunice was not alleged to be with her, but sequestering was Eunice's job. But the witness who made that claim later went to work for the mob, and was almost certain he was a police officer. Later went to work for the mob. And so there's reason to think his testimony was probably fabricated. Now, the trial lasted a number of weeks, and in the end, Luciano was convicted. And he was convicted on this theory that was created by this black woman who no one had ever heard of just a few months earlier. And Dewey, to his credit, on the day the verdict was handed down, he said, "I want to thank my assistants, especially Eunice Carter, who came up with this theory and developed this evidence." And before I hand it over to Leah, I want to mention one more story about this time. There's one story about this time that, as we mentioned in the book, is actually apocryphal. There's a story that, when the plaque honoring Eunice was dedicated several years ago, the plaque in the New York DA's office, I went down there. A number of us from the family were there. And the story was told at the time that because of threats from the mob, Eunice had sent her only son, Lyle, my father, Leah's grandfather, to Barbados to protect him from the mob. And that story actually is repeated in a number of histories of the trial. The only problem is it isn't true. That she had sent her son to Barbados 6 months before she was ever hired by Dewey, before Dewey had even been appointed as the special prosecutor. She sent it there. Nevertheless, it's a good story, and I like it. One other thing, the question that always arises is, why did Dewey hire her? Why did he hire a woman at all? Why did he hire a black person at all? Why this particular black woman? Different sources give different answers, and the files, at least the ones that we were able to see, don't give an answer to that. In fact, there is a personnel file of Eunice's that is empty, except for one piece of paper that has nothing to do with any of these issues. That's in the New York Attorney Archives. But there are a couple of different stories. Whatever the story is, there is some reason to think that there was pressure on Dewey to hire at least one black lawyer because the investigation was expected to involve Harlem, and that the idea was to avoid the implication this was 20 white people investigating Harlem. And somehow, I guess the view is if you have 19 white people and one black person, it would make a difference. But that was what was in the newspapers. Dewey said later it was simply because she was excellent. Dewey said that he interviewed her and she simply overwhelmed him in the interview. And this matters because there were 6,000 applicants, 6,000 applicants for the 20 positions for which Dewey was hiring. The lines stretched out the door of Dewey's office and literally around the block of people coming to do all the interviews himself. And his answer was, I hired her because she was strongly recommended by a judge whom he knew. He didn't say who the judge was. And they had the interview, and she simply blew him away. So who was this this Eunice Carter, this black woman who blew Dewey away in the interview, who came up with the theory and stuck to it, on which Lucky Luciano was convicted, the only crime Luciano was ever convicted of. And for that, we're going to turn it over to Leah.
Thank you. So Eunice's work on the Luciano trial really put her on the map nationally, and it's, as my dad said, the thing that's sort of considered most newsworthy today. But it was really only a small part of her remarkable legal career. One of the things I find very inspiring about Eunice is that even though she was a brilliant attorney, her career wasn't a shooting star of success from the very beginning. She had a lot of disappointments, a lot of starts and stops, and in fact, law wasn't even her first career. When she graduated from Smith College in 1921, she received both a bachelor's and a master's degree in social work. And in fact, she was only the second woman in the history of the college to receive both degrees in 4 years. After college, she did some teaching and social work, and she also wrote fiction. And she actually received some acclaim for her writing. In 1924, she married Leah Carter, a prominent dentist. And in the fall of 1925, she gave birth to my grandfather, Leah Jr. And that same fall, she was inducted into the prestigious Harlem Renaissance organization, the Writers Guild, at the same time as Zora Neale Hurston, who is another one of my personal heroes. And this could have been Eunice's life. She could have stuck with her writing and, maybe become a serious writer. She could have kept doing her social work and really devoted herself to that. Or she could have settled very comfortably into life as a wife and a mother in Harlem society. She came from a very distinguished family, and I think she was well positioned to enter Harlem society. Or she was always part of Harlem society. She was always very social, but she, that could have been her entire life. But she didn't choose any of this. Instead, when she was 28, she made the decision to attend law school. And at the time that Eunice started at Fordham University School of Law, although a handful of Black lawyers had been admitted to practice in New York, the New York Bar Association had yet to admit a single Black member. And at the time, Catholic law schools like Fordham were making an effort to educate students that other law schools were working hard to keep out, specifically women, Black students, Jewish and Catholic and working class students. And one of the ways that Fordham expanded access to legal education was by allowing students to take classes at night, which Eunice did while still practicing social work during the day. She started law school in 1927, but she didn't finish her studies within 3 years. She withdrew in 1928, apparently due to health issues, and returned in 1930, and ultimately graduated in 1932. And she then had to take the bar exam twice before she passed it. In 1933, she opened a small private practice, and while she had some high-profile cases, she did struggle a bit to find clients. So she started to get involved in local politics. She was a lifelong Republican, as her parents had been Republicans, and many Black people were at the time. And she ran unsuccessfully for state assembly in 1934. In 1935, she was appointed by Mayor LaGuardia to the Commission on Conditions in Harlem, which was assembled in response to the Harlem riot of 1935, to examine the causes behind the riot. And her position on the commission afforded her some notoriety in New York, and after this exposure, she was hired as one of Dewey's 20 Against the Underworld. And after the Luciano trial, which we've just heard about, Eunice continued working for Dewey. She really saw Dewey, I think, as a mentor. And when he became Manhattan DA in 1938, she was made a deputy assistant district attorney. And this was very exceptional. At the time in the United States, there were few Black prosecutors, very few female prosecutors, and almost no Black female prosecutors in the country. Her salary at the time was $5,500 a year, which was a lot at the time and made her one of the most highly paid Black lawyers in the country. But many of her white colleagues at her same level were being paid more than she was. She was initially assigned to the Women's Courts and the Abandonment Bureau, which are described in the book as dim graveyards where the careers of female prosecutors went to die. So despite her incredibly important work on the Luciano case, she still wasn't given the sort of exalted position in the DA's office that we might have thought she would get. But she performed her work excellently and enthusiastically. And she was soon made head of Special Sessions, which is the busiest bureau in the district attorney's office. And she supervised several white male attorneys and had a white assistant, which the Black papers at the time loved this. And she tried many high-profile cases when she was running Special Sessions. And during her time at the DA's office, she also founded a special program for the prosecution and rehabilitation of teenage offenders. In this way, she was somewhat ahead of her time. And another way that she was ahead of her time was on the issue of sexual harassment, which was not a widely discussed idea at the time. During a 1937 speech to Howard University Alumni Club, she talked about the changing role of women in the workplace, especially Black women. And she said, quote, "There are men who exact from women a personal relationship of a rather intimate nature in order that women may feel secure in their jobs. Boiling in oil is just a little too good for those kind of men." While Eunice was at the DA's office, she also supported Dewey in unsuccessful bids for governorship and presidency. And finally his successful bid for governor, when he ran for president, he actually ran on a very progressive civil rights platform, and he bragged on the campaign trail that he had a Black woman running the largest bureau in his office. When he became governor of New York in 1942, he took some members he took some employees from the DA's office to Albany with him, and Eunice was not one of them. And we don't know exactly why that is. She was also not on the short list of people who Dewey suggested to run the office. And in the end, he was replaced by Frank Hogan, who was 3 years younger than Eunice. And when Hogan took over, he moved Eunice from special sections to the special part for adolescent offenders. This was a program Eunice had created, and I'm sure she was very proud of it and happy to work there, but she was no longer in charge of a full bureau. And under Hogan, Eunice didn't try any more high-profile cases or get promoted. And so eventually, in 1945, after feeling sidelined within the DA's office, she reinvented herself again by leaving the DA's office and moving into international work, which is what she devoted the rest of her life to. She attended the San Francisco conference at which the United Nations was founded, and later served as the National Council of Negro Women's accredited observer to the United Nations and a consultant to UNESCO. She also argued before the United States Senate in favor of the Genocide Convention after World War II. And unfortunately, she never achieved her greatest ambition, which was to become a judge, but she still had an incredibly impressive career. Now, going back to Eunice's initial decision to become a lawyer, we don't know exactly why she chose to do this. My dad and I have discussed several possible reasons, but there's one story from her childhood that I think sheds some light on the issue. Eunice was born in Atlanta in 1899. Her parents were William Hunton and Addie Waits Hunton, who were both prominent activists who have fascinating stories of their own, and I would encourage anyone who hasn't read the book to read it, just if only to read their stories, which are really great. William and Addie had planned to raise their family in Atlanta, but in 1906, when Eunice was 7 and her younger brother Alpheus was 3, the Atlanta race riot broke out. A mob of white citizens swarmed through Atlanta's Black neighborhoods, intent on destroying Black businesses and harming Black citizens. In the aftermath, many of Atlanta's Black citizens fled, including the Huntons, who moved to Brooklyn. We don't know how Eunice experienced the riots or what she remembered about that time. We do know that the family was home. A white family nearby had offered to shelter them, and they, like a lot of their other families, had chosen to stay and defend their home, possibly armed. We don't know if they were, but it's a lot of Black families would have been armed at the time, specifically for situations like this. As it turned out, they didn't end up needing to use violence. Family legend holds that a white mob that came to the Huntons' neighborhood stopped just one house away from them on their street. So the year after the Huntons moved north, they took a vacation to the Jersey Shore where Eunice met a little boy on the beach. And while they were playing together, she told him, while possibly still thinking in her mind of the noise and violence and fire of the Atlanta riots, that when she grew up, she wanted to be a lawyer because she wanted to make sure the bad guys went to prison. And that is what she ultimately became famous for doing.
We thought that we would close just by offering a couple of quick reflections on lessons that we at least would draw from Eunice's life, although others might draw other reflections. I wanted to mention very, very briefly one particular scene from her life. Leah mentioned a moment ago that Eunice's greatest dream was to become a judge, and that she never became a judge. And then the question is, why not? She had other dreams. She thought for example, that she might be in Dewey's cabinet, and she wasn't when he was governor, and so on. But the judge was the thing she really wanted. Now, why didn't she become a judge? Well, there are a lot of reasons. First of all, no matter how good you are, there's always a lot of really good people who want to be judged, and maybe you just weren't going to fill out of the mix. We could say, well, it was race, or it was gender, it was race and gender, but there were black judges, there were women judges at the time, and during her yearning to be a judge, we saw 2 black women judges appointed in New York. So what else was it? Whatever the reason, the real reason was, Eunice thought she knew the answer. She blamed her brother. Eunice's brother, Alpheus Hunton, who I think was mentioned briefly earlier, was a communist. And I don't mean he was someone who was accused of communism. I mean, he was a dyed-in-the-wool, I love Stalin communist, as a lot of black radicals of the day were. And in the early 1950s, when the leaders of the US Communist Party were indicted basically for the crime of being the leaders of the US Communist Party, Alpheus was one of 3 trustees of a fund that was set up to supply their bail, to raise bail for them. There were 11 leaders, and they were tried. They were freed on bail. They were convicted. They were freed on bail pending sentence. 7 of them showed up for sentencing. 4 of them fled. So the trial judge called in the trustees of the bail fund and demanded to know the names of the people who contributed to the bail fund. And the theory, maybe that's who's hiding them. And the trustees refused to say who the people were who'd contributed. And so they were sent to prison. They were sent to prison for refusing to give up those names. One of the trustees was Dashiell Hammett, the famous writer, who was a good friend of Alpheus's. One of them was Frederick Vanderbilt Field, who was the inheritor of 2 of the great American fortunes, although he was cut off by the family after he went to jail. And the third was Alpheus Hunton. Field and Hammett were sent to a relatively low-key federal prison in the Midwest to do their time. Alpheus Hunton was sent to do hard time at a segregated prison in Virginia. Now, during all of this, Eunice was practicing law. She had a legal practice. She had a lot of experience. She'd been a prosecutor. She'd done some defense work, but she never got involved in this case. From what we can tell, she never offered, and Alpheus never asked. The truth is, by this time, they were estranged. She believed that Alpheus's hardline communism was the reason that she didn't advance as much as as far as she wanted to in a lot of things in life, and particularly in the contest, as it were, to become a federal judge. Now, the lesson from all this, the one I want to mention, there's 2 actually. One is that it's really bad to be estranged from people for that kind of reason. Their political arguments were very sharp. There's no question. They were sharp. They were real. They were on issues of importance, but they were also brother and sister. And perhaps they should have found some sort of modus vivendi. The other issue, the other point, though, is that there is something very troubling even now about the idea of punishing people for their political views. And it's easy to forget the extent to which laws, in effect, against having certain views have been used again and again to stifle radical instincts in the Black community, and this is a good example of it. I think that my own very strong commitment to free speech and very strong opposition to punishing people for their ideas stems from the stories I heard growing up about Alpheus Hunton and the way this man who had a PhD from NYU, his undergraduate degree was from Howard, his master's was from Harvard. He was one of the great experts on Tennyson and the Victorians. He couldn't find a job, after that. He worked in a factory because he couldn't get a job in any kind of academic institution. And for me, one of the big lessons of Eunice's life, in a sense, comes from her brother's life. And it's this sense that we really oughtn't be in the business, I believe at least, of punishing people because they hold very strong views, even when they're views that we disagree with or find dangerous. And I think Leah has some closing also.
Yes. So my personal lesson from the book, this sounds corny, but I really think learning about Eunice was, it taught me a lot about perseverance, personal perseverance and what I could call, I guess, political perseverance. She, as we've heard, had a lot of setbacks in her life. When she didn't pass the bar exam the first time, she got the job in Dewey's office, but then she was given the terrible assignment in the little office at the end of the hall. And she never gave up. She never gave up on herself. And she, I think Eunice always had a sense of what she deserved, that she deserved recognition, that she deserved reward for her hard work. And that, I think, kept her going when at times when she could have just, sort of put her head down and gone, okay, I guess this is what it is. But she always kept going. And I think also political perseverance in the sense of, her whole family had to deal with, just things that are really difficult, well, somewhat difficult to imagine today. And they never gave up. Her parents were both activists. Her mother used to go travel around the South by herself on behalf of the NAACP just to visit local NAACP chapters in towns that were being terrorized by the Ku Klux Klan to sort of reassure the chapters that the national organization hadn't forgotten about them. And, they kept going. Her parents kept going. Eunice kept going. Her brother kept going after everything she went through. And I just found that really inspiring and a useful lesson for so many situations.
So this is really a question for either Professor Carter or Eunice. You talked about Eunice. Leah, I'm sorry. Leah, you talked about Eunice being inducted into the Harlem Writers Guild with one of my favorite writers, Zora Neale Hurston. Can you tell us a little bit about what she wrote about?
So actually, I think my dad he has more experience with reading her writing than I do.
Either one of you. Can you tell us more about what she wrote about?
I'm happy to say something about it. Two quick things to answer that. First, there have been a series of organizations that are called the Harlem Writers Guild. And this is the original one. There's a Harlem Writers Guild today. These series that have been up for them are not connected to each other. They keep arising and dying, and hope the current one will survive. But the original Harlem Writers Guild was limited to about a dozen writers, and all of the big writers of the Harlem Renaissance were members. Eunice wrote short stories, and she wrote book reviews. And some of her book reviews are really, really scathing. There's a book review of hers, of Wallace Thurman's The Black or the Berry, which is in some anthologies to this day. It's just a almost vicious deconstruction of the book. But mostly she wrote short stories. I think she published 7 or 8 short stories. Some of them were somewhat autobiographical. One is about a brief time she spent teaching in Louisiana after college. One is simply about a black woman looking out the window at the Harlem streets and watching as the curfew falls. That is the time that bars elsewhere in the city and clubs elsewhere in the city are required to close, watching all the white people come up to Harlem, watching their window as they all come up, and then they go back, and it's the whole story is reflections on this. Her writing was really quite beautiful. My own view is that the stories, like anyone's, are of uneven quality. Most of them are really quite good, and some of them, particularly a story she writes about taking a walk deep into a southern wood and discovering what's going on there, I think is a spectacular short story. But they were mainly short stories, and they were mainly autobiographical. I think that she had about, it said 7 or 8 published short stories and 4 or 5 published book reviews, but I'm not sure of the number of book reviews. I'm pretty sure of the number of stories.
Thank you. So Leah, you told us earlier about her travails in the DA's office following the trial of Lucky Luciano. And we know that Jane Bolin was the first Black female judge in New York City. We're curious as to whether or not your grandmother, great-grandmother, would have come before her in any cases.
That is a good question. I'm not, it might have happened. She argued a lot of cases. I'm not aware of any, but I think it's certainly possible.
Yeah, I think Leah's right. We did try, we searched various databases for plaque cases that she'd argued. We did find some, but none involving Jane Bolin. And I think that when Jane Bolin was appointed, if I remember correctly, that was in the early 1940s, I think. Is that right? And I think at that time, she was no longer trying cases, I believe. I think that's what we ended up, but I honestly don't remember that detail of the research, but I think that's what we found out.
Professor Carter, you've talked a lot about the, what I guess one would dub the Harlem Renaissance, because it was really a time of a lot of foment and thought, and a lot of very interesting people who lived together. So we actually have a comment from someone in our audience asking whether you're aware of the fact that Eunice Carter, James Weldon Johnson, Paul, and Eslyn Robeson were all neighbors on Jumel Terrace, directly across from the Jumel Mansion.
Yeah, so I did kind of know that in the following sense. So Jumel Terrace was a segregated street, all white, until Eunice and her husband bought a house there, number 10 Jumel Terrace, in the mid to late 1940s. I don't remember the exact date. So at that time became one Black family. And then I don't remember when James Weldon Johnson did, but Paul Robeson, as I recall, bought in 1951, I believe 50 or 51. And actually Robeson wrote a wonderful essay that's just about the view from his front window on Jumel Terrace, which I actually quote in the book. I might add that Eunice and her husband spent a lot of money renovating Jumel Terrace. There's a place they had all these fabulous, number 10 Jumel Terrace, and they held all these fabulous parties and so on. But after her husband died in the early 60s, she sold the house and moved to a smaller apartment on Central Park West.
There's a connection to the Huntons and the Hunton and Williams law firm.
Maybe.
And I just wondered whether you'd ever done anything with that.
Other people have asked us the same question. Without going too deep into the weeds, there's a historian. So Eunice is my grandmother and Leah's great-grandmother. Her father is William Hunton, born in Canada. William Hunton's father is Stanton Hunton, who was born enslaved in Virginia as Staunton Hunton in probably 1809, maybe 1808, but probably 1809 he was born. Now, the historical record is unclear as to exactly how Staunton Hunton came into the possession of Thomas Hunton, who owned him for a time and left him to his wife. Nevertheless, there is a historian who says that Thomas Hunton's brother William was Stanton Hunton's actual father, and if that's true, that matters because it was it was William Hunton's great-grandson. Grandson. It was William Hunton's grandson who founded Hunton and Williams. So if indeed William Hunton was his father, then they're like second cousins or something I don't remember. We calculated the degree of relation. We put it in the book. The reason I say that with a grain of salt is that our research suggests that William Hutton probably wasn't Stanton's father, that his father was probably a man named Gustavus Horner, who would have been his father and would have had relations with his mother, whose name was Betty. And since a relationship between a person and another person owned his property, it's fair to describe it as rape. And that's probably, we don't know for sure, the other historian could be right, but that's probably Stanton Hutton's father. And if that's the case, then it was no relation to William Hutton. He just got the Hutton name when he was eventually sold, still as a child, into the Hutton family. So it's possible. I just want to say it's possible that it's the same family as the one that founded Hutton and Williams. We just don't know that for sure. I should say we know that he was owned by the family. We don't know if the family's blood was in his veins. That's what I'm trying to say.
Leah, you were about to say something.
Oh, just that we joke that we should get reparations from Hutton and Williams.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Absolutely.
We should write them a letter. I'll write one this afternoon.
Write them a strongly worded letter.
So really early in Eunice's life, Addie decides to take herself off to Germany, and she enrolls at the Kaiser Wilhelm University, and the children go to a private German language school. So were you aware, Professor Carter, of your grandmother speaking German later on in her life, or can you tell us anything about that?
Oh dear. Well, I'm going to try to give you a short answer, but Leah can also talk about that time in history, at least, if she wants to. So you have to understand, the stuff in this book, when I was growing up, I didn't know any of it. I'll make that very clear. I knew vaguely that my grandmother had been a lawyer. I knew that her brother had been in prison. And that was about it. All I knew was that she was this incredibly stern woman. She terrified us. She was always correcting our grammar and our table manners and so on. We were so scared of her. Only through working through this project did I come to understand, in effect, why she was the way she was, not only because of things she'd been through, especially when she was younger, but also because to work her way up through the New York legal establishment, to work her way through the cases that she tried and worked on, the other things she did in life, she had to develop a very tough, intimidating exterior, or she wouldn't have made it. That was the way you avoided in those days, I think, getting crushed if you were Black, in particular, if you were a Black woman. So I came to understand her better, but I didn't know she spoke German. And until I worked in this book, I never understood what I knew my father spoke German. But I never knew why he spoke German. I mean, he spoke it a lot, but he did study it in college, and he spoke German words sometimes, and spoke to us in German now and then, but I never knew why that was. And it just hadn't made the connection that it was because his mother had spoken German, had learned to speak German, actually was apparently quite fluent in German during this time that she'd been studying abroad, that her mother had been studying abroad.
One other interesting note about the book, and it's a point that you, Professor Carter, and you, Leah, make. It says something about the fabric of the woman, your grandmother and your great-grandmother. In 1989, they lived in a 12-room house in Atlanta that was staffed by a cook, a maid, and a man to tend the furnace and the garden. That couldn't have been your typical life for many people of color.
Well, maybe not. And again, Leah might want to speak to this also, but Eunice always emphasized, she always said their house was very modest. They lived in a neighborhood of Atlanta where there were a number of Black families who were middle class. The cost of labor was extremely low. A lot of people had hired help of various kinds, but they were not a wealthy family by Atlanta terms or by Black Atlanta terms or anything like it. They were a middle class family. There were some very wealthy Black families who lived in the area, but their home and circumstances were quite modest by comparison with a lot of others in the area.
Yeah, I think this is always one of the really fascinating things about studying a lot of different historical periods is how cheap labor used to be and how many people would have, hired help who didn't appear to be that wealthy. But one thing about them is, one thing I realized going through William Hunton's letters, which also included a few letters from Addie Hunton, they were often very strapped for cash. There were a lot of times when Addie was writing to Jesse Moreland, who was William's best friend, basically asking him for money, just asking him for some money to get through the next few weeks or whatever. So yeah, they not only were their lives modest, there were times when they were, pretty dire-ish straits.
Well, I think we're coming, unless there are other questions from the audience. Well, one quick question before we turn this over to Judge Weber. Before that, I will introduce the Dean of Fordham Law School to say a few words. We have a question from the audience asking if Eunice Carter had a good relationship with the other 19 lawyers in the office, and did they accept her work as being important?
That is a reasonable question. Based on the records, we can say that she had a good relationship. I think Leah will agree with us with some of them. So, for example, she worked closely with Mary Gerfine, later a very distinguished federal judge. The two of them ended up working together to organize the materials for the prostitution case. And there were some other lawyers whom also came to respect her over time. In fact, there's a story in the book in which she and another lawyer, obviously a white male lawyer from the office, are in a bar, not a bar, but a club in Harlem, and somebody basically comes over to them and offers them what can only be termed as a bribe. So she clearly had good relations with some of them, but the people who were most tightly around Dewey, if you look at the records, at least that exist, their paper records with her were simply very officious. Do this, don't do that. Usually little scribbled notes in the corners of other memos. The lawyers who were up and down her hallway, who were upper hallway, she's at the end of the hallway, the lawyers further up her hallway seemed to be the ones with whom she was closest. I don't know, Leah, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we know that she was close with a few people. I don't think we had any evidence of sort of any kind of general, of them treating her particularly badly. Aside from the fact that she, didn't get a very good assignment at the beginning, and it was hard for her to get Dewey's attention. Even when she came up with the theory about prostitution, it took her a long time to get it to Dewey's attention. But yeah, I don't think we have any, I don't know if you remember anything, Dad, but anything about her having bad relations with anyone or being treated particularly.
No, it's just that last point I'm glad you made, which I'd forgotten, which is there was a shield of people around Dewey whom she had to get through, basically, when she would send memos up the chain of command, and usually nothing would happen. Memos about prostitution, about this theory and that theory, and nothing would happen, Constantly, repeatedly, nothing would happen. She wouldn't even get a meeting with Dewey to discuss them. That took a long time. She was hired in August, and apparently her first meeting to discuss prostitution with Dewey, as opposed to occasionally something on another case, was in January. So you can see how hard it was actually for her to get through that screen of senior people whose job was to essentially, in their mind, I think, keep Dewey focused on, let's not do prostitution, let's do something else.
Fascinating woman, fascinating life, fascinating history. I'm sorry, Professor Carter, that you won't be able to stay with us for the panel as we continue on in the program. We well understand you have a busy schedule. Leah, thank you so very much. We are now going to turn to an introduction of the Dean of Fordham Law School, and then I will turn the program over to Judge Weber. Matthew Diller is a prominent scholar on social welfare and policy. He is the dean of the Fordham Law School, and that, of course, is the alma mater of the Franklin Williams Commission and of Eunice Carter. And if I didn't, by the way, thank both of you as I'm rushing through the program, please understand that we could talk about this book for at least another hour, if not more. I keep going back over my notes, and I love this book. There's so much about it that resonates with me. There's so many things I would love to have touched on that we couldn't. Like, for example, the fascination with Egyptology that many people of that era had, and people in Harlem, and my own family. That's a conversation for another time. But thank both of you for your tireless work in researching your grandmother, your great-grandmother, bringing her to life for us today. We really can't thank you enough.
And thank you for having us. I'm sorry that I have to leave now, but this has been a great pleasure and an even greater honor to be a part of this program. So thank you all very much again.
Thank you. And now we turn to the dean of Fordham Law School, the alma mater of Eunice Carter and of Franklin Williams. Again, I think many of you can read the details about some of our more prominent citizens who wanted to take up their time and talk about Eunice and contribute to this program. But I want to talk to you a little bit on a personal note of Matt Diller, who, along with the deans of the 15 law schools in New York, was ex officio when I chaired the Committee on Legal Education and Admission to the Bar for the state bar exam, which is the oldest standing committee of the bar exam. And although most of the deans were not active participants, Matthew Diller was one of them who was. I would characterize him as a thought leader on our committee. And while we didn't always agree, I respected his opinion and his views. And I was really very disappointed when, after we talked about him co-chairing the committee with me, he called me one Saturday morning to tell me that, happy for Fordham but sad for me, he was going to be taking the deanship at Fordham and leaving Cardozo, and he would not be able to devote the time to co-chairing the committee with me. But I have to tell you that I continued to go to Matt Diller for advice, for counsel, and also worked a great deal with his wife, Kit, who's a fellow environmental attorney in my former career. So Matt and I have many, many connections. I give you Matt Diller.
My name is Matthew Diller, and I'm the Dean of Fordham Law School. And I want to thank our hosts who organized such a great program for us this evening. The Historical Society of the New York Court System, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion of the Unified Court System, and the Franklin Williams Commission. And the story of Eunice Carter is a story that needs to be told, needs to have a broad audience, and that we need to reflect on and think about both how astonishing her career in life was and how much she could accomplish given the environment that she lived in the society at the times, and also the lessons that it holds for us today, and how the fact that many of the same problems are still with us. We are fortunate today to have Professor Stephen Carter, who has written a superb biography of his grandmother that I commend to all of you. And I have to say, I myself am so proud to be the dean of the law school that graduated Eunice Carter and enabled her to practice law and achieve many of the things that she went on to achieve in her career. When I think back, and this is not from personal knowledge, when I think back at the Fordham Law School of the 1930s that Ms. Carter attended, it was overwhelmingly a part-time school, an evening school. Most of the students were working, as was Ms. Carter. It was located in the Woolworth building, and even though the school was less than 25 years old when she started, it had already produced a number of astonishing figures who went on to great careers in the law, including 2 chief judges in the New York Court of Appeals, a future New York State Attorney General, and our first African-American female graduate, Ruth Whitehead Whaley, who graduated in 1924. And Whitehead Whaley later wrote an essay about the double burden of being both a woman and a member of a minority in the legal profession. And her words, which she wrote in the 1940s, really continue to ring true today about the double burden that women of color face in our profession. Well, Eunice Carter's story is one of both struggle, but also of triumph. And you will hear of her astonishing accomplishments and the impact she had. And it's at this moment particularly fitting that we pause and take stock at both what one individual can achieve with tremendous brilliance and determination, and also at the magnitude of the obstacles that she faced at that time, many of which are still with us today. Anyway, I wish you all the best. Take care and be well. Thanks.
D.A. Cyrus, or Cy Vance, is a graduate of Yale undergrad and Georgetown Law School. Upon his graduation in 1982, he began his legal career with the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. After leaving the office following serving about 6 years, he co-founded a Seattle law firm and was an adjunct professor at Seattle University School of Law. He then returned to New York to join a law firm here in New York. D.A. Vance was elected district attorney in 2010, following the retirement of the Honorable Robert M. Morgenthau. His strategy or mission as DA has been to develop community-based justice, an initiative to improve the working relationship with the community members and with community organizations, thus improving the public's perception of the district attorney's office and of prosecutors. This last weekend, he took part in a gun buyback program in Harlem designed to get illegal guns off the streets and to stem the rise of gun violence in the city. As DA, he has promoted diversity and inclusion in the office by creating a chief diversity officer position and by promoting and appointing unit and bureau chiefs of color. His office has continued to recruit attorneys of color to the extent that, as I mentioned previously, there are about 22 Black female ADAs, and a little bit more than 10% of the total number of ADAs in the office in the trial division are of color. And I am sure DA Vance will continue to make sure that those numbers rise. DA Vance has also established a conviction integrity program, crime strategies unit, a cyber crime and identity theft bureau, forensic science and cold case unit, a hate crimes unit, a public integrity unit, a special victims bureau, and a vehicular crimes unit. More recently, you may have seen his name mentioned in connection with the enforcement of a subpoena for a certain ongoing grand jury investigation. With that, I give you DA Cyrus Vance, Jr.
Thank you, Judge Weber, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm very, very happy to be able to join you today in celebrating the remarkable life of Eunice Carter, who, as you all know, was a trailblazing prosecutor with the New York County District Attorney's Office, and who overcame racial and gender prejudice to mastermind, as you've heard, one of the great public service successes in New York State history. Her courage, her intellect, and her integrity and tenacity in the pursuit of justice remains one of the hallowed sources of inspiration and pride for all of us here at the DA's office, from our rookie and newest prosecutors to our most senior executive level staff, as we strive to protect New York County and to advance the justice system forward each day in our work. I'm very grateful to the Historical Society of New York Courts, the Franklin H. Williams Judicial Commission, and the New York State Unified Court System's Office of Diversity and Inclusion for making today's event possible. It really has been an honor to participate alongside such a distinguished group of judges, lawyers, and scholars, as well as Eunice Carter's family members. And I want to especially acknowledge her grandson, Professor Stephen Carter, and her great-granddaughter, Leah Aird Carter, for giving us such a fabulous insight into Eunice Carter's life and legacy. And thanks to the professor, whose award-winning biography entitled Invisible ensures that Eunice Carter's legacy remains not only visible, but revered for many years to come in the legal profession and beyond. Now, in our office's archives, as Professor Carter said, there's a famous picture of District Attorney Tom Dewey and his staff of 20 who brought down the biggest gangster of the day, Lucky Luciano, as you've heard. And for generations, observers of that team portrait have noticed that the legendary prosecutors known as the 20 against the underworld consisted, as Stephen said, of 19 white women and one young African-American woman, who was Eunice Carter. She started her career in the office in perhaps a routine assignment, working in municipal court, where she was often confronted with arraigning prostituted men and women. But what started out as a very routine assignment, as we've all learned, turns out to be anything but routine when she began discovering an odd pattern. All of the women who came through her courts were represented by the same lawyers, who were bailed out by the same bondsmen. And if their cases went to trial, all got off with the same improbable defenses supplied by the same cast of witnesses. And so Eunice Carter came to believe that the prostitution industry must be racket run by organized crime. And so, as you've heard, she went to Thomas Dewey with her hunch that fighting the prostitution racket would provide the leads Dewey was looking for to climb the ladder of organized crime and to bring down, finally, Lucky Luciano. And Dewey at first resisted because he did not believe that the office's job was to go after prostitutes, as we've heard. But eventually, we believe, and certainly history shows, that Carter's logic and persistence swayed him. In one weekend, the DA investigators brought down 80 houses of prostitution, and Dewey's team set out to gain the confidence of those working in the brothels. His 20 assistants eventually persuaded some of those under arrest to testify, and as we've heard, in this way, they painstakingly built a solid case against Luciano, and the most important figure in organized crime was convicted, and his life of crime ended. Now, since 2006, a bronze plaque with Eunice Carter's image and accomplishments has graced the wall next to the 7th floor elevator in the DA's office. And a copy of that plaque is behind me here. And we placed that plaque by the elevator because the elevator is notoriously slow in coming, and we wanted to make sure that people had a good, long opportunity to learn about Eunice Carter and read about her life. Not only did Eunice Carter play a crucial role in putting Luciano behind bars, an incredible feat in the 1930s in New York, but I think in doing so, she also helped shape the face of this office and of modern prosecution. Her iconic life reminds us that the difference one person can make and the inspiration one person can provide for those who follow. With that said, it's my great honor to rededicate this plaque downstairs in recognition of Eunice Carter's contributions to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, the New York State legal community, and certainly the legal profession as a whole. Thank you, Judge Weber, and thank you all for letting me participate today.
Thank you so much, DA Vance. And now we turn to a more historical part of the program, which includes the Carters, but will expand upon the Carters and bring us, certainly, I think, up to current time. And I'd like to introduce the moderator for that panel, the Honorable Justice Rowan D. Wilson, an Associate Judge of the Court of Appeals. I had the honor and the pleasure of hearing Judge Wilson for the first time last February during Black History Month, and it was in the rotunda of the state Supreme Court. I think it was 60 Center Street. And we are so thrilled that we have a student of history like Judge Wilson readily agreeing to be a part of this inaugural program. And I say inaugural because I do hope that it is the first of many dialogues and discussions that we will have with authors about similar books, featuring people of note and engaging in the dialogues about diversity and inclusion, which we're about to embark upon now. So I give you Judge Wilson.
Good afternoon, everyone. And let me just start by saying we have a terrific panel that I have the privilege of moderating. You've met two of its members already. The third, I'll take a minute to introduce, is Justice Dianne Renwick, the Appellate Division First Department, which that court is considered by many to be the finest commercial appellate court in the country. And I consider Justice Renwick to be one of the finest jurists in the state. She's an inspiration to me, not simply for her work on the bench, but for her devotion both in her professional career has been entirely in the public service, And her personal life is the same. She has really devoted the entirety of herself to helping others. And so with that, let me, the other two panel members you've met, Ms. Carter and Justice Weber, let me kick this off by the observation that you heard from both of the Carters, that Eunice really wanted to be a judge and was never able to be a judge. And we do have two judges here and perhaps a judge in waiting, we don't know. And she couldn't. And she couldn't because of racism, certainly, because of sexism, certainly, and because of her brother Alpheus's political views. Now, in reading the book, it struck me that it's sort of unfair to deny somebody a judgeship for which they otherwise would be eminently qualified because of a relative's political views, let alone judging any person by his or her political views. But in listening to Professor Carter, the following idea struck me, that a particularly pernicious thing about prosecuting people for different political views is that members of a minority group are more likely than others to have views that are out of the mainstream. And so it isn't maybe just racism, sexism, and political views. Maybe it's really just racism and sexism in this case. With that framing, what I wanted to start by asking Justices Renwick and Weber is, how did, if at all, racism, sexism, other obstacles, unfairness, affect them as they develop their careers? And do they think now people, let's say in Leah's generation, have it a little bit better, a lot better, not better at all? Maybe start with Justice Renwick.
Well, thank you. And Justice Wilson, Judge Wilson, I first want to thank you for that really lovely introduction. Thank you so much. And I admire you equally. I also want to digress for a moment. And Leah, although I know your father is not here, I want to thank him and you for the excellent lecture and for sharing your family's rich history and revealing this forgotten story of your grandmother's extraordinary life and success, and of the community in which she lived, and the society, or society, as I think your father wrote it in the book. I've been a fan of his since Emperor of Ocean Park, but this was a nonfiction writing. It was real, it was factual, and it's so important to discuss the history of people who have otherwise been written into the shadows. And so I thank you both for bringing her into the limelight, where she belongs, and hopefully will educate us and many others about the history of Blacks and Black lawyers in particular. So thank you. Okay, so for sure, the issues of bias caused by decades of blatant racism and sexism existed explicitly and probably more implicitly at the time in my experience, at the time I graduated law school, which was in 1986, and when I became a judge, which was in 1997. But each of these experiences is, I think, is personal. It depends on the path you've taken, sometimes just how implicit or explicit it was. And I guess I was fortunate because, having made my career in the public sector, people there were more liberal-minded, more open-minded, more welcoming of an African-American woman. I began my career in the Bronx, and I began there after having taken a clinic at my law school that was conducted in the Bronx, and the professors had practiced at the Legal Aid Society of the Bronx. So they were able to show the students the ropes in that county. And then when I actually became a lawyer and practiced in the Bronx, I knew many people there already. And so I was sort of guided around. He introduced me and the students to a Black attorney who sort of took us under his wing and made sure we knew everyone. You could go into any part with a senior legal aid attorney and ask for assistance or guidance because they were that welcoming and interested. From there, I went to the federal defenders. I found out about the position because the only Black supervising attorney at the Legal Aid Society whispered to me about an opening, and I applied there. And then when I went to the housing court, again, I was fortunate to have a judge recommend me for the housing court. There were, that was an appointed position. After that, I had 2 elected positions and then another appointed position. I was appointed to the housing court by the chief administrative judge, who at the time was Jonathan Lippman, who was committed to appointing women and people of color. So I would say that because of that, because of the path that I took and because of the people I encountered who definitely made it easier. I mean, in some of these experiences and in the readings I've read, where and the things that have happened where court attorneys can be difficult to attorneys by asking them, asking for ID when they're sitting in the well of the court. I know all of that happens for sure, but I had the experience of having African-American court officers in the Bronx criminal court protecting. No one ever would have dared to speak to me in that way or do anything like that. So I had my protectors, fortunately. And as I said, the appointments came from people who were open-minded and coming from a community in the Bronx County, where there's a large number of people of color. So then the people who are the county leaders and otherwise who nominate you happen to be people of color. And the committees are diverse. So I think the statements I'd like to make about that, and the takeaway from my experience at least, is that the mentors are extremely important. Mentors are very important in helping to guide a path for you and helping to educate you about what's important and how to go about achieving the goals that you want. And in addition, the people who are empowered to make these decisions, who nominate people, who appoint people, have so much power, and it depends oftentimes what their political ideology is, because oftentimes whether it's in the states or in the federal court, the more liberally ideology, the more diverse the court, the more willing to make particular appointments. I was born 6 decades after Eunice Carter, and it took 4 more decades after that before the first appointment was made of an African-American woman to the appellate division. That was in 2008, and it was me. And in 2008, I think between 2008 and 2009, several appointments of people of color came. And I would say that's because of the last 3 governors. So is there racism, sexism? Are those things boiled into what we call implicit bias? Absolutely. And does it exist? Absolutely. And and I think I'm fortunate, as I say, because of the path I took at the Legal Aid Society in the Bronx, and having been elected from the Bronx, made a big difference. And I'll let Troy get a word in before I go into statistics and things like that.
And Justice Weber, before you start there, so Eunice Carter thought she had a mentor in Thomas Dewey, and it turned out she didn't. How do you find mentors?
Are you asking me?
Justice Weber, yeah.
Well, to answer your question, I served as a court attorney to William Davis, who was a elected Supreme Court justice in Manhattan after I left the district attorney's office. And so when I became a court attorney, it was never on my radar at all to become a judge. I never thought about it whatsoever. And he was my mentor in that he encouraged me to not only think about becoming a judge, but he actively encouraged me to put in my papers to become a judge, to go the elected route, actually. And so he was my mentor. And so in terms of how do you find a mentor, I was privileged because I worked for him and worked for someone who, thought it important to give back. Also, the Franklin H. Williams Commission, we have a mentor program, and under our mentor program, we do mentor individuals who wish to ascend to the bench. So obviously it's a little easier now for those who are interested in becoming judges, because the Franklin H. Williams Commission has a mentoring program. A couple of the other bar associations have mentoring programs as well. So we do have the ability to reach out to those individuals who want to become judges and to assist them in going on to the bench.
And so, Leah, thinking about your contemporaries, classmates from law school or college who've become lawyers, do you have any sense that your contemporaries of color have it less on their mind to become a judge, or view that as a harder road for them than their, let's say, white male contemporaries, or not?
So this is something I've really had conversations with people about. I haven't had a lot of conversations about who wants to be a judge. It may just be the people I know it hasn't come up for. But so I can speak to this a little more theoretically. But one thing I've found in various contexts is that sometimes it can be hard for people. There's certain impressions that you have to think about yourself. And I think so to be a judge, one of the things you're supposed to be is objective. And I think in various ways, it is people of color and women are viewed as inherently less objective than white men. So at least that's an experience I've had in various contexts. And so I can see that being, I don't know to what extent it is an obstacle for people, but I can certainly see that as being an obstacle in for people of color who want to become judges.
Let me direct you back to something that Justice Renwick said, that she, when she started out, went into sort of government service, public service, public sector, I think is the way she put it, because people there were more welcoming. My own, thinking back to my law school days or college days, I would have said the same things about my classmates of color, that was an articulated reason, but also if you looked at it, if you just looked at numbers, and I didn't count, but anecdotally, more people of color in my law school class and the classes around it went into some public sector in some way or another than my white classmates, particularly my white male classmates. Do you think that's still true?
I haven't noticed that as a trend. I've certainly known people of various races who've gone into the public sector, but it's not a trend that I've noticed. And I don't know if that's a generational thing or just the people I happen to know.
And
So,
I just want to correct one thing. I didn't go into there because it was more welcoming, but what I found was that it was more welcoming. I went in because I had this excellent experience in my law school clinic.
Well, and also you're an altruist. I think that was probably part of it.
That was the underlying reason.
I was going to say, Judge Wilson, in response to that question, that there are many layers to that. And I had noticed the same when I was in law school, that most of us lawyers of color went into government service or public service. However, now I'm noticing that more are going to firms. And I actually had a conversation about this with my daughter, who graduated last year, and I asked her about this, and she kind of confirmed that more lawyers of color are going to firms. Now that creates a couple of issues. One issue, and let me just back up for a second, one of the main issues that we've seen is that enrollment of individuals of color is down in law schools. The enrollment numbers are down, and there could be various reasons for that. It could be the fact that it's so costly now to attend law school, but enrollment is down. And what we've seen even more prevalent is that enrollment of Black males in law school is down. So we have fewer Black males who are attending law school, okay? So now, again, I do believe that there are more individuals of color who are going to firms. than who are going to government service. The problem we have with that now is that historically, when we were drawing our pool, our pipeline of individuals to become judges on the trial bench, at least, we drew them from court attorneys, from former prosecutors, from former legal aid attorneys. So now, if you have less individuals of color who are going to government positions, you have less individuals who are in the pipeline to become judges, again, at least on the trial bench. And circling back to Black males, we have very few Black males who are in the pipeline now to become judges, and again, individuals of color to become judges as well. So it is a problem. There are positives because yes, they're going to firms, but there's also that negative, which we didn't kind of look at before in terms of that pipeline to the bench.
And can I just say, sorry if I might just add to what Troy said, and I think she touched on it at the end, is that that's a positive. That's a very good thing that we're going to law firms now. What we need to do is focus on how to generate more lawyers of color to come to be lawyers. That's really where I see the issue, and I think that's what what Justice Weber, is saying as well. We sit and admit lawyers all the time in the First Department. You can, count on one hand. Sometimes there are no Black men in the pool. Sometimes there are no more than 3. So definitely we see it in real time, firsthand. But I think that we need to increase the number of lawyers, young people becoming lawyers, and that's a real pipeline issue as I see it.
I do note that many of the recent appointees to the federal bench in the New York area have come from law firms. So it's not out of the question that somebody could be crazy enough to go to a law firm and then wind up on the bench.
Yeah, but we do know that there's a difference, although we on the state bench may not wish to admit it. There is a difference between being a judge on the state bench and being a judge on the federal bench. It's the fact that you're there for life, that it's a lifetime appointment. But yes, you do have definitely. But again, that pipeline, we need that pipeline. And so when you and I went to law school, there may have been that the thoughts that you were kind of not being pushed, but government service was more attractive. We need to just find that balance where you're making that decision that you want to go into public interest law, as opposed to you feel that you're not going to be accepted if you go to a law firm.
Former Secretary of Homeland Security Jeh Johnson, who's now at Paul Weiss, issued a report that had been commissioned by the Chief Judge. It's entitled Equal Justice in the New York State Courts. And a couple of months before that, the Judicial Friends Association also submitted a report covering much the same territory. I thought I would start with Justice Weber because she is on the Franklin Williams Commission, which was originally founded in 1991 as the Commission on Minorities, and the report by Secretary Johnson really, I think, frames its work around the Commission's initial mission. And so I thought I'd start with you there if you had observations about that report or the Judicial Friends report, and sort of a level set on where we are now compared to where we were 30 years ago.
Well, I certainly agree with with most of the findings, as well as the recommendations by Secretary Johnson, as well as the statistics that were put out by the Judicial Friends. They were obviously on point. I will say that we do have issues with the Office of Court Administration in terms of their compiling statistics. So it was rather difficult, it is difficult at times, to really figure out where exactly we are, because there can be a certain lack of transparency in obtaining those statistics. And I know Judicial Friends had problems trying to obtain them. And also, I noticed that Secretary Johnson had problems in obtaining them as well. However, I do agree, as I said, with the findings of Secretary Johnson as well as his recommendations. It was certainly a Herculean task given the time constraints, the fact that he had to conduct most of the interviews via Zoom. It was unfortunate that he wasn't able to actually meet with individuals, the individual employees and the staff at the courthouse in person. The Williams Commission, we've done this in the past where we've gone to the various courthouses, we've met with the supervising judges, we've met with the administrative judges, we've met with the individual employees. And when you meet on a one-to-one basis, it becomes a little bit easier because you have the ability to have a conversation. And in all honesty, they, in fact, perhaps are maybe a little bit more honest with you, at least so you'll be able to draw them out perhaps a little bit better than when this is done on Zoom. Unfortunately, the report by Secretary Johnson, as well as the report by the Judicial Friends, simply reinforced much of what we knew or what we suspected. And while we have made great strides in terms of diversity and in terms of maintaining a bias-free court system, there's much that has to be done. As you stated, Franklin Williams rendered his report in the late 80s. And a lot of what Franklin Williams stated in that report are still prevalent today. A lot of those issues are still prevalent today. And so all we can try to do is to work on the recommendations by Secretary Johnson. I know that the Chief Judge is dedicated to implementing change. And, we at the Williams Commission will work together with Mr. David and, in attempts to making sure that, again, we have a bias-free court system.
One thing I wanted to ask Justice Renwick about is something that struck me from the report, which is the report recites the conclusion of the Minorities Commission of Franklin Williams report from 1991, that there are two justice systems at work in the courts of New York State, one for whites and a very different one for minorities and the poor. And that conclusion, was, as I read it, was not, that is the currency of that conclusion, was based not so much on the personnel or the makeup of the people in the court system, but on the fact that there are structural impediments, that there are courts, for example, the housing court, the family court, that are so under-resourced and that tend to serve poor people and communities of color, that those people are not getting the kind of justice that we all aspire to. And Secretary Johnson made clear that he was making that observation, though those kinds of changes are outside of his mission. His mission was, what can the courts themselves do? This is something that would need a broader action, legislative action, gubernatorial action. Justice Renwick, do you have any thoughts about that?
So just let me be clear. You mean you're not talking about the conditions of the courts?
Oh, I am.
You are, okay.
Conditions rather than the personnel, right?
Rather than the personnel, right, exactly. I would love to think, just to go back, I would love to think that when I was in the housing court, someone coming in and seeing me and my being able to be compassionate and understanding with that person would have made all the difference. But I have to admit that you are right, because there are statistics that show that a large percent of the Black population doesn't have confidence in judges and otherwise. Now that may be because of the number of the paucity of judges in certain courts. But one of the things that stands out to me is that when I started as a judge in 1997, I had not been in, as much as I had worked in the Bronx, I had not been in the housing court. I worked in the criminal court, which is in a different building. And then as a judge, I had to park at the entrance where one would see first, right away, the housing court. And it was atrocious. It was really atrocious. It was like cattle, like shuffling cattle. It was just people on top of one another in the hallways, waiting for their cases to be called. It's demoralizing. A new housing court was built, but unfortunately it was almost too small by the time it was open. And I think that's where we find ourselves now, with structures that The court system is trying. It was built, I think it opened in 1990, around 1997. I think in 1997, maybe the Bronx Housing Court, for example. But so quickly, the buildings become, too small, just can't handle the capacity anymore. And what do we do about that? We need funding. I mean, there has to be funding to change those kinds of things. But I agree that those kinds of changes demoralize people. They make people feel that they're not worth the courts improving. And it's a tremendous problem. I don't know the solution for that.
I think we definitely need funding, but I will say that I would venture to say that if you had attorneys who were handling commercial cases, or attorneys who were handling trust and estates matters, that if they had to go to a building such as the housing court building, or if they had to go to a building such as family court, and they had to wait in the halls and, in terms of just the general layout, I think there would be an uproar from the bar concerning, concerning the appearance and concerning what was going on. So yes, I certainly agree that it does require funding. However, I do find it interesting that, again, this has been allowed to go on during a period of time when the court system has had the money, to make these changes. And unfortunately, it does send a message to the litigants, to the individuals who are using the housing court, family court, and criminal court, that they are not as important, or that they are not viewed as important as other litigants.
I agree completely, and I think in the report by Secretary Johnson, he noted that in the commercial parts, there are 3 law secretaries, for example,
Exactly.
Whereas in the housing court, there are none. I completely agree. Perhaps my saying funding is not quite the word. Perhaps it is the resources, but reallocating the resources.
Most definitely. Yeah, I totally agree with you. And in terms of diversity, diversity on the bench is certainly important because, my sitting on the bench, if a litigant walks into the courtroom, a litigant of color or a defendant of color, and I sat on the criminal side for a good portion of my career. So a litigant of color, a defendant of color walks into that courtroom. There's a level of, let's say, comfort. Not that, that my decision is going to be, in their favor just because they're Black and I'm Black, but because I think that they perceive that the system is going to be a little fairer because the judge sitting there is the same color or same ethnicity that they are. So definitely, when I sat criminal, defendants were not pleased, perhaps by the outcome of the case or by the ultimate sentence that I imposed. However, I do believe, and I've been told this actually by defendants, by their families, etc., that they did know that there was that, as I said, there was that comfort level because they knew that I was going to render a fair trial and I was going to give them a fair trial and that the system was going to be fair. Not to say that my white counterparts, are not fair. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm simply saying that where you have a bench that is reflective of the population that the court serves, I think, again, it just gives the perception that the system is fair.
I just want to add to that. I agree. And as I was saying, I would hope that my being there and being compassionate could do that. But when I practiced in the criminal court, I thought I had seen everything. I mean, the courts weren't great by any stretch of the imagination. And I had gone from practicing in the criminal court to going to federal court for 8 years, where everything is gleaming white marble. And then I came back, and that's when I saw the housing court. and there was nothing like it, and no amount of, no, I'm sure it absolutely, and we definitely have to have more judges. I'm not suggesting that we don't need it, but the question it was whether that alone will make the difference. And that does have to happen. We absolutely need more judges on the bench, but given the condition, it is just not going to do it enough. When people come in and their children are crying and they're asked to leave and the bathrooms are filthy and they're just not treated well, it is a completely demoralizing situation like none I had ever seen in my life. I will say that was 1997. And as I said, there was a new court, but it quickly became, there were too many people. I can't say that I've been in the housing court recently, but I'm going by what I've read in the reports. So I agree with what Justice Weber has said, but I just want to add that footnote.
So we do need to wrap up, and I wanted to go back to Leah and switch topics a little bit. The book chronicles, and I think you and Professor Carter, went through some of the difficulties, adversity that Eunice had to face, but we also have to remember that there were external challenges as well. I mean, she lived through the Spanish influenza as a teenager. She graduated from law school right at the start of the Great Depression. The Scottsboro boys are convicted in 1935 when she's been, just appointed to the DA's office. The world that she lived in had a lot of troubles, a lot of challenges, and people today, we have our own pandemic, we have our own economic dislocation, we have a fair measure of political turmoil. What lessons do you think we can take from her in sort of not falling into a depression? I mean, I don't mean an economic depression, I mean an emotional depression.
That's a great question. I think one of the lessons is remembering that the time we live in isn't as exceptional as we think it is, that all those things you just mentioned, happened. Like we're not the only people who've lived through a pandemic or who've lived through crazy political times. And so I think it can be good to have a little bit of perspective, because sometimes it's like everything is falling apart, completely hopeless, this is the worst things have ever been. And I think having some historical perspective, that similar things have happened before, and that and that we can move on from them. Which is not to say they're not horrible when they happen, but that history keeps going, I guess, and that we can keep moving on through things.
Do you think the arc of history is still bending the right way?
Yeah, no, I've actually been thinking about that phrase recently and which way the arc. I don't know that I don't know that I believe the arc of history necessarily bends in any particular direction, but I think it's our job to try to bend it.
Well said. So with that, thank you to all. It's been a great discussion. And I need to turn this back over to Eileen.
Again, the way I would answer that question, Judge Wilson, about the arc of history, I think it was President Obama said it bent toward justice. Well, I have a friend who's the managing partner, one of the very few Black managing partners of a firm in Washington, D.C., Beveridge and Diamond, the first environmental firm in the country, started by Ruckelshaus. And Ben says, we have to grab the arc and we have to do the bending. So I really think that that's what we have to do. I think that this program today is a little bit of a piece of trying to think about how we can advance people on the basis of talent. And that is one of the ways I think we help to bend the arc, so that we, at the same time that we're bending the arc, we're creating a society that is stronger and more inclusive. And I think just a better society for all of us. So I thank you, Judge Wilson, the members of the panel, Leah, Judge Renwick, Judge Weber, all of you who took the time and trouble to listen today. If you haven't read the book, please go back and read it. It is really just such a fascinating piece of history, and it's real life. It's not even fiction, but it does read like fiction in some ways. So thank all of you, and on behalf of the Franklin Williams Commission, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion for the Unified Court System, and the Historical Society of the Courts, we really thank you for taking the time to be with us this afternoon.